Hello, and welcome to this podcast from the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies.
Hello, and welcome to this latest OIES podcast. My name's James Henderson. I'm a Distinguished Research Fellow at the Institute. And today I'm with Mustafa Uki, who's a Senior Research Fellow who covers Africa and the Middle East for us. And we're going to talk about a paper that he published back in the beginning of October called Market and EU Green Regulation Challenges for MENA's Gas Exporters to Europe. Now, today we're recording on October the 28th at about 9:30 in the morning UK time, just in case we say anything that is time sensitive. But with that, Mustafa, welcome back to the OIES podcast series.
Hi, Jim. Nice to be here.
Great. Well, look, let's get into your paper. It looks at medium to long-term challenges that are going to be faced by MENA gas exporters to Europe. And I'm guessing that it's really around those challenges involved with the energy transition in Europe. But give us a bit more background as to what you see the challenges for MENA exporters.
When you look at the situation, especially in Europe, the European gas market, you look at regulation. One thing I need to specify for simplicity, I'm going to use the terminology, the European gas market. I'm aware that we're talking about different European gas markets with different characteristics, etc. But for this discussion and the paper, I've used, for simplicity, the European gas market. Now, the main challenges facing not only MENA gas exporter to Europe, but also, the US, the GCC, and possibly other potential exporters are, first of all, the size of the European gas market or the potential size of the European market in the long term, medium to long term, and also the impact of the EU green regulations. So these are the two main challenges or categories of challenges that MENA gas exporter to Europe face.
MENA is obviously quite a big and diversified area. So what gas producing countries or sub-regions are you expecting to be most affected by the sort of headwinds created by the transition?
Yes, indeed. The Middle East, North Africa, if you look at the region itself, going from the Atlantic all the way to the Arab Gulf, we're talking about countries with diverse economic, political, cultural, etc., population size, but also distinct differences in energy or oil and gas endowment. So in this paper, in this discussion, we're talking about existing MENA gas exporter to Europe, namely Qatar, Algeria, Libya, and Egypt. Although in the case of Egypt, yes, it was a net exporter last year, but because of severe gas balance challenges and difficulties on the supply side and the consumption side, Egypt is now a net importer. Would that last for a long time? It's difficult to tell at the moment.
Okay, well, let's get into some of the gas market aspects and challenges that you see. With the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the decline in Russian exports to Europe that sort of catalyzed, I think most people would have seen that all exporters of gas to Europe were in a pretty advantaged position, and with Europe scrabbling around trying to find alternative sources of supply. But I guess you're suggesting that actually there are challenges involved as well. So what are the challenges as opposed to the opportunity?
The Russia-Ukraine war triggered a call for alternative supplies or incremental supplies from existing producers. But the challenges that I see are long-term challenges. And it's about the size of the European gas market in the future. Now, if we look at the data, we see that over the last 3 years, Europe gas demand or gas consumption declined by over 100 BCM. And that's quite significant. Now, the question which is posed, whether you're an exporter from the MENA region or the region, is this decline structural decline? Is it a cyclical decline? Are we talking about demand destruction? This is the big question at the moment. And even when you look at the scenarios that different institutions have put together, we do see a decline. But the biggest uncertainty is by how much this market is going to shrink.
In the paper, what do you suggest in terms of where the market's going?
In terms of the paper, what I have done is to look at possibilities of the market shrinking. One thing I need to specify: when I say the market is shrinking, I mean, I'm not talking about natural gas disappearing completely from the energy mix in Europe. I'm talking about significant reduction. Now, it's very difficult based on what is going on at the moment to give you an idea by how much the size is going to be reduced. But the fact that especially North African countries or North African gas exporters rely heavily on the European gas market, and this dependence varies from over 40% for Egypt all the way to 100% for Libya. That is the dependence on the European market as part of total gas export of the country. So that's a main worry.
And I guess it's difficult for them to diversify. Is that what you're saying? Essentially, there's not a lot of opportunities in other markets for them.
Yeah, I would say there was this question of if the European market is not available, we're going to send our LNG gas to other locations. Now, in the case of North African countries, it's going to be very difficult because they have fixed cross-border gas pipeline linking them to Europe. So they're not going to be able to. Now, the flexibility is going to be for LNG, but the move to other markets beyond your national markets are going to be difficult. First of all, you have to have the infrastructure. If you're talking basically about Asia, you have to have the shipping capacity. And also in Asia, once they see this distortion or in the market, or the fact that, new suppliers are looking away from Europe and looking for new market, the price structure or the price expectations are going to change. They're not going to charge them the same way they used to charge them. So there's some price implication and infrastructure implication as well. So the shift to other consumers is not going to be easy.
And you've written in the past about how MENA, particularly North African producers, are struggling to balance domestic demand with the kind of exports. So, I mean, what really are the long-term export prospects for MENA gas producers? Are they going to go into decline in tandem with the European market, or are they really going to be hit if the European market starts to go into sharp decline before production?
This is the key point, Jim, when it comes to the North African producers. Now, the North African gas producers and gas exporters are faced with two main constraining factors. The first one is an upstream one. There hasn't been enough investment to prove up additional reserves. If you look at the state of the reserves at present, relative to their consumption, it's very limited. And of course, domestic consumption is a very constraining factor. If you look at the numbers for 2023, we see that domestic consumption, or if you look at it, domestic consumption over market production, you see that it varies from maybe 50% all the way to well over 100%. And that's for the case of Egypt. So it is a major issue in North Africa, the fact that they're unable at the moment to restrain this domestic demand. And this is, as you know, it's due to subsidies, etc. So two main constraints: domestic gas demand and the fact that not enough gas has been proved. Now, to answer your question in terms of prospect, it's difficult to give you a figure, but it will be limited in terms. We're not talking about 100 BCM or something of that order. We're talking about 20, 30 BCM for the most, if nothing changes on the upstream or the supply side and on the consumption side.
So I guess the question then is, does it matter that the European market's going into decline if they're not going to have that much more to export?
Good question. First of all, natural gas is not going to disappear from Europe's energy mix. They will still be consuming natural gas in Europe. But the problem for North African gas exporter is the fact that their natural market, or basically their only market, is Europe. Now, if that market disappears, as I was saying earlier, it's going to be difficult to find an alternative market. So, and we're not talking about huge supplies of gas. So they'll be able to place maybe 10, 20, 30 BCM here and there. And that is very critical to those North African exporters. If you look at the GCC countries, the order of magnitude, especially for Qatar and the US, the order of magnitude is different. But for North African exporter, Europe is still very important. In terms of whether it does matter or not, you have to look at the timing. If you're talking about the long term, beyond 2030, beyond 2040, possibly, yes, it becomes an issue because North Africa will not have enough reserves. If nothing is done, if ceteris paribus, nothing changes, North Africa will have very limited supplies to make available for exports. And the fact that you will have some fierce competition for whatever is left of the European market. So to answer your question, it is very relevant for GCC countries, not only Qatar, but even smaller producers and exporters like UAE and Oman, who are expanding their LNG capacity, and they look at Europe as part of their diversification policy. So they will place volumes in different markets. So it will be important for those markets. But for North African, if nothing major changes on the supply and demand side, it's going to be difficult really to worry about, the long term.
Okay, I mean, so that's the market side, and obviously that's one element of what you've been talking about, but the green regulation challenges is the other element. So let's talk about that a bit. I mean, the Green Deal in the European Union includes a package of regulations, but which ones do you think specifically might affect MENA's gas exporters?
I've listed, three, if I remember. The expanded ETS, which covers now maritime operation, which means LNG shipping is going to be affected, which means additional cost. I've mentioned also the EU directive for internal market for renewable gas, natural gas, and hydrogen. But the most constraining one is going to be the methane emissions regulation. Another thing I have to add is the CBAM. Although the CBAM regulation does not affect oil and gas import into Europe, but it does affect product that the MENA gas producers and exporters are exporting at the moment, especially if we talk about gas-based chemicals like fertilizers that these countries are exporting, especially Qatar, Egypt, and Algeria, who are among the largest exporter of gas-based fertilizers. So again, CDM is not included, but it will indirectly affect them. But the most important piece of legislation is going to be, in the long term, the methane emission regulation.
And given that, are MENA exporters taking reduction of their GHG footprint, and particularly, I guess, flaring and methane emissions seriously? What are they actually doing to react to the EU regulations?
Of course, this reflects my personal opinion. I think that there has been a misperception of how MENA look at the issue of climate change or the issue of reducing the greenhouse emission footprint and the whole question of environmental question in general. This may have been the case in the past where other priorities were put forward. And yes, even at the moment, it's very difficult to get the right information in terms of how much is emitted, even to agree on how much is flared. But in recent years, things started to change. And there is a sort of prise de conscience among MENA countries that the question of climate cannot be ignored. In fact, they're living it firsthand, like we see in Europe. We have seen extreme weather events in the Middle East and North Africa region that are really affecting all the areas. So there is this kind of awareness. And if you look in terms of action, and if you look at the MENA region as a whole, we see distinct measures, distinct actions. If we look at, for example, the GCC, we see that in relative terms, more is being done in terms of preparing for the reduction of greenhouse gas footprint. And when compared to a North African gas exporter, we see that, less is done in North Africa. And that reflects the fact that there are differences in resources, differences in focus. So overall, yes, based on information we have at the moment, and in relative terms, the GCC countries are developing a number of measures to reduce their carbon footprint and reduction of their methane emission. The other thing I would like to say, when it comes to this reduction of carbon footprint and looking at the whole climate issues, there's a dilemma that many countries are facing, especially those who rely completely on oil and gas. On the one hand, their economies have depended for a very long time on oil and gas export revenue. And the level of diversification is very limited. Some may say, oh, they have petrochemicals, they have steel, they have everything. But all these other industries rely heavily on attractive, or to put it plainly, cheap feedstock, cheap energy. So it's still related thing. But on the other hand, they see that they're facing a climate situation where they can see exactly how their economies are going to be affected. So there is this kind of thing. And on top of that, there is this question of fairness. You have attended the last COPs, and you have seen, how the global south look at this question of fairness in energy transition. So to go back to your questions, yes, there are a lot of actions that are being developed. And when you look at the most constraining regulation, methane emission regulation, to the best of our knowledge, they don't have an MRP system in place. But if you look at what the Gulf countries are doing and contrast it with other within the MENA region, you see that they're more advanced and they have the possibility of adjusting the new regulation, the new EU regulations.
And I guess there's a lot of uncertainty about which EU regulations are going to be imposed and how hard they're going to be imposed and whether they're going to be in any dispensations. I mean, are MENA exporters hoping that the green regulations may not affect them as much, or are they how are they dealing with the uncertainty, if you like?
The uncertainty, especially if you look at the one I've singled out as the most constraining regulation, the methane emission regulations, which has been issued this past summer. There are a couple of uncertainties. The first one is how the methane intensity is going to be defined and calculated. And according to what has been announced by the EU, it will be announced or defined during the summer of 2027, if it's not delayed, if everything goes according to plan. There is also the uncertainty in how penalties are going to be applied for exporters that do not comply with the EU regulation, and that is left to the member state themselves. So there is no clarity on that. There's no clarity on what the intensity is going to be. There is no clarity how the penalty is going to be defined, calculated. There is also no clarity in terms of, existing contractual commitment that not only MENA gas exporter, but all gas exporter to Europe. If you look at some of the wording, like all reasonable efforts in terms of, making sure that methane emissions are addressed, I mean, some countries will look at this terminology as potentially discriminatory in terms of, deciding on what is, equivalent and what is not equivalent, how these contracts are going to be treated. There are a lot of uncertainties, and MENA countries, I mean, we have seen a lot of statements from different gas exporting countries. We have seen the US taking a different approach of possibly negotiating with the EU directly an agreement. But in the case of Middle East, North Africa gas exporter, I think they may consider this direct contact and direct negotiation with the EU. That's a view. But there is also the fact that they need to understand what is at stake and how are they going to clarify these uncertainties. At the moment, it's still not clear how it's going to be implemented. The other thing is there is a question of would they move to other markets? But as I said, it's not going to be that easy.
You also mentioned that the methane and decarbonised gas package, including hydrogen. So what are the potential for North African countries, particularly exporting hydrogen and kind of exploiting the transition in Europe and using their infrastructure to sell something different?
Yeah, I was referring to this directive where it says that no unabated gas should be imported into Europe beyond the 31st of December 2049. So that's the constraint. Now, with respect to hydrogen, there has been a lot of hype about the role of hydrogen, replacing gas. There has been concern, of course, by, I suppose, TSOs about what is going to happen to their gas infrastructure. And the idea was to to change from natural gas to hydrogen. Easy said, but not easily implemented. I think now there is a reality check when it comes to hydrogen. But looking at the MENA region and maybe specifically North Africa, because it is the area which has been targeted by the EU in different reports as a potential source of green hydrogen to Europe, I think we're still a long way from that happening for obvious reasons. First of all, there is no market or global market for hydrogen. All these MOUs that have been signed have not been followed by decision to invest or any type of investment. So to talk about hydrogen going from North Africa to Europe within the next 10, 15 years or even beyond is not realistic as long as there is no commercial framework that will facilitate that kind of situation. And if I may add, Jim, this is obviously a personal view. When you talk about North Africa, which is using fossil fuels to generate electricity, and then suddenly you dedicate huge capacities of renewable energy to supply the electrolyzer, huge electrolyzer capacity to send the hydrogen to the thing, is a bit paradoxical. How come, you have a situation in developing economies or African countries where the share of renewable energy in their energy mix, electricity mix, is very limited, and suddenly you allocate a lot of renewable energy exclusively for the production of hydrogen. But again, this is not going to happen if the commercial conditions are not there, and they're not there as we speak.
Okay, so just to conclude then, just briefly, I mean, what do you think? What are the overall conclusions of your paper? I mean, you've talked about the market and the shrinking gas market and the opportunities being limited. Clearly, green regulation, there's going to need to be a response to that. Do you think overall then that the European market is going to be significantly declining importance to MENA gas exporters, or is it going to remain a key place for them to sell their gas?
If you look at the regulation, beyond 2030, 2040, if you look at North Africa, its potential decline in terms of supply availability to export gas to Europe, this regulation will not be that relevant. If you look at MENA gas export in general, more specifically, the GCC countries, not only Qatar, but even possibly the UAE and Oman, it's a different situation. It is very relevant. In terms of market, again, this is a question which comes back all the time. It's very difficult at the moment to assess the size of the market, but it's clear that the direction of travel is very clear. It's declining. And the question is it worth investing? When I say investing, I'm talking about the long term. Please keep in mind that everything I'm saying is beyond 2030 or even 2035 or 2040. So is it worth investing in export to a market with a dwindling gas market, and also a market which will have penalizing regulations? So that's the question which is posed. I'm afraid I can't answer it in quantitative terms. Now, the other question is, people may conclude, okay, so forget it. We're not going to look at the gas market in Europe. We're not going to pay attention to the EU regulation. To which I said, no, decarbonization and methane emission reduction measures do matter, and they're very important. Why? Because if you look at regardless of Europe's gas market, whether it's going to be going to very low level, 100 BCM, 20 BCM, to me, this is irrelevant in the long term. Why? Because the question of reduction of the greenhouse gas emission footprint of all the oil and gas producers, and specifically those countries which depend on external finance, it is very important. So it's very important that MENA countries, all MENA countries, whether we're talking about the GCC or the North African countries, they have to continue to work on the reduction of this GHG footprint. Why? Because first of all, is to address their energy transition objective, although they have different pathways than maybe some other countries. And the other thing is the growing scrutiny of financing institution, insurance institution when it comes to project finance to fund a gas project, gas infrastructure project. So it's very important. We've talked about the market in Europe. Yes, that's the situation. But regardless of what the market is going to be, continuing this reduction of greenhouse gas footprint in the MENA countries is extremely important.
Okay, great. Well, Mustafa, thank you very much indeed for that. That's fantastic. Your paper, as I've said, is available on the OIES website. So please do go and download that if you want more information on Mustafa's analysis. But in the meantime, there'll be another gas program podcast coming out in a couple of weeks, so look out for that. But Mustafa, thanks very much for your time and the discussion. Take good care of yourselves, and goodbye.
Thank you for listening to this podcast from the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. You can find other podcasts, as well as our written research, on our website at www.oxfordenergy.org. If you would like more details about our energy transition, gas, oil, electricity, or China research programs, then please contact us at information@oxfordenergy.org.